April 18, 1943, 700 miles from Guadalcanal. The Pacific stretched endlessly below Captain Thomas Lanfear's P-38 Lightning. His fuel gauge read lower than it should. One drop tank hung larger beneath his left wing, the other smaller on his right. They didn't have enough of the big tanks to match them properly. So they flew asymmetrical, unbalanced, improvised, technically impossible according to the manuals. The mission required 600 miles to intercept, then fuel enough to fight, then 400 miles home. His Guimardle Lightning wasn't even the extended range variant. Those wouldn't arrive until summer. Lanfear checked his watch. 18 minutes to intercept. The radio crackled with static and tension. Intelligence said Admiral Yamamoto's transport would arrive exactly on schedule. The architect of Pearl Harbor. The man who awakened the sleeping giant. Flying predictably, punctually, fatally, because the Americans had broken Japan's codes, because they knew his exact route and timing, and because, impossibly, they had a fighter that could reach him. The twin Allison engines thrummed steadily. Fuel flowed from the mismatched tanks beneath his wings. In 3 hours, Lanfear would shoot down Yamamoto's G-4M Betty bomber over Bougainville. He would become an ace. The mission would be called Operation Vengeance. History would call it Justice. But in that moment, as he watched his fuel burn and his gauges hold steady, Lanfear realized something that would be buried by official narratives for decades. He was flying a mission that generals in Washington had declared impossible. He was proving that American fighters could strike deep into enemy territory, escort bombers anywhere, reach any target. And those same generals would ignore that proof for 2 more years, while thousands of American airmen died over Germany in unescorted bombers. The war had been answered, but the question remained unasked. The doctrine had a name, the Bomber Mafia. It had believers at the highest levels of the Army Air Forces, and it had a foundational belief that would cost more American lives than any single battle in the European Air War. They believed bombers could defend themselves, that massed formations of flying fortresses and liberators, bristling with 50 caliber machine guns, could fight their way through enemy fighters without escort. That precision bombing would win the war, while fighters played supporting roles. That range didn't matter, because bombers would bomb their targets and return safely. Through sheer firepower and tactical brilliance. General Hop Arnold believed it. He commanded the entire Army Air Forces. General Ira Eaker believed it. He co-wrote a book with Arnold in the 1930s explaining why bombers would dominate future warfare and why fighters would be obsolete. General Carl Spaatz believed it. These men wore stars on their shoulders and conviction in their hearts. They were intelligent, experienced, confident, and they were catastrophically wrong. But in 1939, when Lockheed designed the P-38 Lightning, the doctrine was gospel. The Army's design proposal, Circular X-608, emphasized speed, climb rate, and firepower. It mentioned range as an afterthought. The contract explicitly prohibited external fuel tanks. Not discouraged, prohibited. Because if you believe bombers don't need escorts, why design fighters to escort them? The Lightning emerged anyway. Twin-boomed, twin-dungeoned, unmistakable. Two Allison V-1710 engines driving counter-rotating propellers, a central nacelle housing the pilot, and a devastating battery of weapons, one 20mm cannon, and 4 50 caliber machine guns. It could climb faster than anything in the sky. It could fight at altitudes where other fighters gasped for air. And despite the prohibition on external tanks, it carried 306 gallons of internal fuel, more than any American fighter then flying. But fuel capacity means nothing without context. The P-39 Airacobra carried 120 gallons for its single engine. The P-40 Warhawk carried 146. The legendary Spitfire carried a mere 102 gallons. The Lightning carried more than double any of them. But it also burned fuel from 2 engines. The mathematics were promising, but not decisive. At 9,000 feet, burning 58 gallons per hour at optimal cruise, the P-38E could fly 870 miles. Respectable, not revolutionary. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, when it arrived a year later, carried 305 gallons, virtually identical to the Lightning. Its single massive engine burned fuel almost as fast as the Lightning's twins. Range was nearly equal, but neither aircraft could escort bombers deep into Germany on internal fuel alone. Everyone knew it. The solution was obvious. External drop tanks. jettisonable fuel tanks that could be carried to extend range, then dropped before combat to restore performance. The technology was proven. German fighters used them in Spain. Japanese fighters used them in China. Even the British were developing them. But in America, Hap Arnold had spoken. The memo dated 1939 was clear. No funding for drop tanks on tactical aircraft. Curtiss could develop them at their own expense if they wished. Any company could, but the Army Air Forces would not pay for them, would not prioritize them, would not acknowledge the need. The buck stopped with Arnold. Lower-ranking officers occasionally suggested drop tanks might be useful. Those suggestions went nowhere. You can find the memos if you search the archives. Polite inquiries, tentative proposals, all ignored. Because what matters isn't what subordinates suggest. What matters is what commanders actually do. And what Arnold did was pour resources into bizarre alternatives. The YB-40, a heavily armed B-17 designed to escort other B-17s. It couldn't keep up after other bombers dropped their payload. The program failed. They tried using B-26 Marauders to escort fortresses at high altitude. The B-26 couldn't reach the necessary altitudes. That failed to millions spent on solutions that didn't work, while the simple, proven solution remained prohibited. But there was a man named Benjamin Kelsey, a captain, a test pilot, a man who had helped design the specifications for the Lightning itself. He had flown more fighter types than perhaps any pilot alive. He understood aircraft design intimately, and he understood what prohibition meant in a bureaucracy. It didn't mean impossible. It meant forbidden, which meant if you were careful, if you were clever, if you risked your career, you could do it anyway. In 1940, Kelsey approached Lockheed quietly. He suggested they begin developing drop tanks without a contract, without compensation, without official approval. Republic Aircraft balked at the same suggestion. They had the P-47 to worry about. They couldn't risk angering Arnold. But Lockheed listened because Kelsey had credibility. Because they'd worked together since the Lightning's inception. And because Lockheed's chief engineer, Kelly Johnson, saw the same truth Kelsey did. They had an advantage. The Navy wanted drop tanks for the Lockheed PV-1 Ventura patrol bomber. The British wanted them to. That meant Lockheed could tool up production with paying customers. The P-38 used similar mounting systems. The tanks could be adapted, so they built them. 165-gallon all-metal pressurized tanks. Everything the Bomber Mafia opposed, but perfectly functional, and technically legal because they weren't officially for fighters. Then there was the F-4, the photo reconnaissance variant of the Lightning. Was it a tactical aircraft? Strategic? The definitions were murky. Arnold's prohibition mentioned tactical aircraft specifically. Reconnaissance aircraft lived in gray areas. Colonel George Goddard, who championed reconnaissance aviation, saw the same gray area Kelsey did. The F-4 needed range to penetrate deep into enemy territory. Who could argue with that? And if reconnaissance Lightnings carried drop tanks, well, surely fighter variants could too. December 1941. Pearl Harbor burned. America entered the war, and the first P-38S equipped to carry drop tanks rolled off the production line. They were F-4 reconnaissance aircraft, not fighters. The distinction was technical. The capability was real. April 1942. The P-38F became the first fighter variant capable of carrying external tanks. This was before the P-47 Thunderbolt entered service, before the P-51 Mustang existed with the Merlin engine. The Lightning could already reach targets that other fighters couldn't approach. 165-gallon steel tanks extended its reach dramatically. With two of them, the Lightning could escort bombers anywhere in Germany. This was mathematically provable, tactically feasible, strategically obvious. But Ira Iker commanded the 8th Air Force in England. In August 1942, he stated clearly that bombers could operate fine beyond fighter range, that few worthwhile targets existed within fighter escort range anyway, that fighters were useful for penetrating the German fighter belt near the Channel, but unnecessary deeper into Germany. He believed this. Arnold believed this. Spaatz believed this. So when P-38 Lightnings began arriving in numbers in late 1942 and early 1943, where did they go? Africa, the 12th Air Force. The Mediterranean Theater. General Jimmy Doolittle wanted them. He got them, because the men commanding the strategic bombing campaign didn't see the need. They had P-47 Thunderbolts in England, good high-altitude fighters. Short-ranged because Arnold's prohibition meant no suitable drop tanks existed in quantity. But that didn't matter, because the bombers would protect themselves. August 17, 1943, Schweinfurt and Regensburg. The 8th Air Force launched a double strike against ball-bearing factories and aircraft plants deep in Germany. Beyond fighter escort range, 376 B-17 Flying Fortresses, Thunderbolts escorted them to the German border, then turned back, fuel exhausted. The bombers continued alone. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them. Bf-19s and Fw-190s attacked in waves. Head-on passes where the fortress's defensive firepower was weakest. Rockets fired from beyond machine gun range. Fighters ramming bombers in desperation. The sky became a killing field. Bombers fell trailing smoke and flame. Parachutes blossomed like funeral flowers. 60 bombers failed to return. 60 out of 376. More than 15% losses in a single day. 600 men dead, missing or captured. Many more wounded. The bombers that returned landed with dead gunners, shattered cockpits, wings, held together by cables and prayer. Ira Eicher assessed the mission afterward. He concluded the destruction inflicted on the enemy outweighed the losses. The bombers had done their job. The doctrine held. They would continue. October 14, 1943, Schweinfurt again. 291 B-17s. Deeper penetration, heavier losses. 60 bombers lost. Another 600 men, hundreds more wounded. The 8th Air Force called it Black Thursday. They suspended deep penetration raids afterward, not because the doctrine was wrong, because they needed time to rebuild strength. But in the Pacific, things were different. General George Kenney commanded the 5th Air Force. He had P-38 Lightnings. He had no patience for doctrine that killed his men. When he needed drop tanks for his P-47s, he didn't wait for official channels. He had them designed in 2 days, built in theater. Steel, non-self-sealing, pressurized with engine manifold air. Every forbidden feature, every practical solution. In 2 months, the tanks were in service. His fighters could escort bombers. His bomber losses dropped dramatically. Hop Arnold heard about this. He complained that Kenney could develop drop tanks in 2 months while official programs dragged on for years. The irony seemed lost on him. He was the reason official programs dragged. He had created the roadblocks. The prohibition on pressurizing tanks, the requirement that tanks double as bombs, the insistence on self-sealing drop tanks, the ever-shifting specifications that made it impossible for manufacturers to tool up production. Every roadblock designed to appear reasonable while preventing progress. Republic Aircraft designed multiple drop tank variants for the P-47 200-gallon metal tanks, 200-gallon vulcanized fiberboard, tanks with internal baffles, and wind-driven fuel pumps to avoid the pressurization prohibition. Both passed testing. Neither was purchased in quantity. Instead, the Army bought 75-gallon tanks, sized 4 P-39s and P-40s, useless for high-altitude escort, but acceptable because they didn't threaten the doctrine. The tank they did buy for the P-47 was nicknamed the Bullfrog, a compressed paper ferry tank suitable for long-distance delivery flights but useless in combat. It had no baffles, no high-altitude fuel feed. It couldn't be used in any maneuvering. Ace Francis Gabreski said it looked like a bullfrog mid-croak. It was perfect for the Bomber Mafia. It extended ferry range without enabling escort missions. It solved a logistics problem without challenging doctrine. Meanwhile, Lockheed was producing 165-gallon steel tanks at a rate of 300 per day by mid-1943, the P-38J model. Arriving in August 1943, added 110 gallons of internal fuel by placing tanks in the wing leading edges, where intercoolers had been relocated. Total internal capacity, 410 gallons. With 2 165-gallon drop tanks, a Lightning could fly over 2,000 miles. Combat radius exceeded 1,000 miles with fuel remaining for 20 minutes of combat. March 3, 1944. Berlin, the sirens wailed, the flak burst, the German capital, 450 miles from England, deeper than any fighter had reached. The Luftwaffe rose, expecting unescorted bombers. Easy targets, routine slaughter. But the bombers weren't alone. Silver twin-boomed shapes materialized through the clouds. P-38 Lightnings from the 8th Air Force, the first Allied fighters over Berlin. They'd flown the distance, fought the battle, and returned. 3 days later, P-51 Mustangs would follow. History books would often claim the Mustangs were first. They weren't. The Lightning was, but the moment carried bitter irony. It was March 1944, Schweinfurt. Had been August and October 1943. 7 months. 7 months when Lightnings could have escorted bombers but were scattered across Africa and Italy. 7 months when P-47s could have carried proper drop tanks but didn't because those tanks weren't purchased. 7 months when doctrine murdered men who could have been saved. The P-38J and later models could escort anywhere the P-51 Mustang could. Range calculations vary by altitude and configuration, but the mathematics are clear. At optimal cruise with internal fuel only, the Lightning could reach 1,220 miles, with two 165-gallon drop tanks. Factoring 20 minutes of combat at full power, escort radius exceeded 850 miles. The Mustangs, often cited 800-mile radius, assumed tactics not typically used, keeping the fuselage tank full into combat, which created dangerous center of gravity issues. In the Pacific, 5th Air Force Lightnings and Thunderbolts flew escort missions to Bellicopan. With combat radius exceeding 800 miles, the longest escort mission any Mustang flew reached approximately 700 miles. Not because the Mustang was inferior, it was an excellent aircraft, perhaps better suited to European combat than the Lightning, but because the narrative that only the Mustang had sufficient range was false. Demonstrably, historically false. Official Army Air Force's charts published after the war showed this deception clearly. The P-47 chart displays an early model without increased internal fuel, with minimal external tanks. Not the D-25 model with additional internal fuel and twin 165-gallon wing tanks that could escort to Berlin. The P-38 chart doesn't show dual 165-gallon configuration at all, but the P-51 chart shows an optimistic 850-mile radius with dual 108-gallon tanks, a best-case scenario requiring full fuselage tank combat operations. The narrative was crafted carefully. If you ignore the Lightning entirely and show only short-ranged P-47 configurations, you can claim no fighter could escort deep into Germany until the Mustang arrived. The claim appears in countless documentaries. Books repeat it as fact. The Mustang saved the daylight bombing campaign. The Mustang won air superiority over Germany. The Mustang made victory possible. All true in their way, but incomplete. The truth is that the Lightning could have done it earlier. That men died unnecessarily, that doctrine killed them. That the Bomber Mafia's unshakable faith in self-escorting bombers created a catastrophe they refused to acknowledge until the casualties became impossible to deny. Benjamin Kelsey risked court-martial developing drop tanks without authorization. Kelly Johnson risked his company's contracts supporting him. Colonel Goddard exploited bureaucratic ambiguity to equip reconnaissance Lightnings. They conspired to solve a problem that shouldn't have existed. When Hap Arnold discovered Kelsey's work, he couldn't punish him. Arnold had bragged at a Washington dinner that fighters could fly across the Atlantic. Roosevelt demanded he deliver. Suddenly, Arnold needed exactly what Kelsey had built. Insubordination became salvation. But thousands of airmen weren't as fortunate. They flew into Germany in bombers that could have been escorted. They died when Lightnings could have protected them. They burned because doctrine mattered more than reality. After the war, the architects of failure received promotions. Hap Arnold became a 5-star general, the only Air Force officer ever to achieve that rank. Carl Spaatz became first Chief of Staff of the Independent Air Force. Ira Iker made 4-star general. Their careers flourished. Their narrative endured. But truth survived in technical manuals and flight logs. In mission reports from the Pacific, where doctrine bent to survival, in testimony from men like William Emerson, a P-47 pilot, who later taught history at Yale. In 1962, he spoke at the Air Force Academy about the Bomber Mafia's mistakes, about delayed drop tank development, about wasted resources. His transcript exists today on the Academy website. Dry, factual, damning. The Lightning served throughout the war. It shot down more Japanese aircraft than any other fighter. It killed Yamamoto. It photographed invasion beaches. Pilots called it the fork-tailed devil. Germans called it Der Gebelschwansteufel. They feared it. They should have feared it over Germany in 1943. But doctrine is seductive. It provides certainty in chaos. It offers intellectually satisfying solutions. It allows leaders to decide confidently, even when catastrophically wrong. The Bomber Mafia believed deeply. They believed strategically. They believed fatally. If you're fascinated by untold World War II history and the hidden truths behind famous battles, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, whether it's Berlin, Tokyo, New York, or a quiet town that history forgot. These stories deserve to be remembered, and your support keeps them alive.